The document sat in a sealed file at the National Archives for 73 years. When researchers finally opened it in 2018, they found something no one expected: a confession. Not from a criminal, from a government. In 1945, a US military physician wrote 8 words that would be buried until most of his test subjects were dead. We knew the dependency risk. Distribution continued regardless. He was talking about methamphetamine. This isn't about Breaking Bad or trailer park stereotypes. This is about what your government did to soldiers, to housewives, to entire cities before the word epidemic ever appeared. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian, but only if you can handle where this goes. Comment your location below and brace yourself. What you're about to learn connects ancient Chinese medicine to modern American streets through a chain of decisions that were never accidental. Phone away. Distractions silenced. Let's go back to the beginning, and I mean the actual beginning. Before we dive into 5,000 years of history, drop your location below. Tell me, have you ever wondered how meth became meth? Subscribers already know we don't sugarcoat this. Long before laboratories, long before the word methamphetamine existed in any language, long before governments, cartels, or pharmaceutical corporations, long before anyone imagined chemistry could be weaponized, there was a plant. Somewhere in the mountain ranges of Central Asia, possibly 5,000 years ago, maybe longer, human beings discovered Ephedra sinica growing wild across the humid highlands. The exact moment is lost to deep time, buried in an era when history was still oral, when medicine was inseparable from survival. The ancient Chinese called it Ma Huang. They didn't fear it. They couldn't. In a world without antibiotics, without surgical precision, without any of the medical infrastructure we take for granted, Ma Huang was essential. It opened airways when respiratory infections meant death. It sustained energy during brutal winters when starvation was a real possibility. It was woven into the fabric of survival itself. For thousands of years, through the rise and fall of dynasties, through the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, through the golden ages of the Tang and Song, this plant remained nothing more than medicine. Herbalists cultivated it in mountain gardens. Physicians prescribed it for conditions we now call asthma, bronchitis, chronic fatigue. It appeared in the Shenong Benkaojing, one of the oldest surviving medical texts, dated to approximately 200 BCE, but containing knowledge far older. The plant traveled the Silk Road, carried by traders who understood its value, from China to India, where Ayurvedic practitioners integrated it into their own traditions, from India to Persia, where it was studied and refined, eventually to the Arab world, where Islamic scholars documented its properties with scientific precision during Europe's Dark Ages. In every culture it touched, ephedra was respected, valued, ordinary. No one imagined that hidden inside this quiet herb was a molecular structure that would one day be isolated, synthesized, modified, and transformed into one of the most devastating substances in modern history. The plant grew. Empires rose and fell. The herb remained constant, a footnote in the grand sweep of civilizations, mentioned in passing in medical texts, prescribed by healers who never questioned its place in the natural order. For 5,000 years, it was simply part of the landscape, part of survival. And then came the chemists, 1893, Meiji-era Japan. A chemist named Nagayoshi Nagai was working in a laboratory in Tokyo, part of Japan's aggressive modernization campaign. The nation had spent decades absorbing Western scientific methods, determined to match European powers in every field, from engineering to medicine. Nagai's assignment was straightforward. Isolate the active compounds in traditional medicines to understand precisely what made them work. Modern chemistry applied to ancient knowledge. When he turned his attention to Ephedra sinica, he succeeded. He extracted a crystalline alkaloid from the plant, the specific molecule responsible for its respiratory and stimulant effects. He named it ephedrine. The substance was clean, measurable, reproducible. Everything pre-modern medicine was not. At the time, it was simply science, a minor breakthrough in a minor corner of pharmaceutical research. Ephedrine showed promise for treating asthma and low blood pressure. It was studied, documented, filed away. The world kept turning. 24 years later, in 1919, another Japanese scientist entered the story. Akira Ogata was working in the same tradition as Nagai, isolating, purifying, refining. But Ogata went one step further. He didn't just extract ephedrine from the plant, he altered it. Using a process called reduction, Ogata modified ephedrine's molecular structure. He removed a hydroxyl group, made the molecule smaller, more lipophilic, better able to cross the blood-brain barrier. The result was a new compound, N-methyl-alpha-methylphenethylamine. He called it methamphetamine. In his laboratory notes, preserved in Japanese archives, Ogata described it as a more potent stimulant than ephedrine, faster onset, longer duration, more pronounced effects on the central nervous system. He had no way of knowing what he'd created. At the time, methamphetamine was just another entry in the expanding catalogue of synthetic compounds. Chemistry was exploding in the early 20th century. Thousands of new molecules synthesized annually, most destined for obscurity, a handful destined to change everything. Methamphetamine sat on laboratory shelves for nearly 2 decades, largely ignored. A curiosity. Theoretically interesting, but practically useless. Medical journals mentioned it occasionally in articles about stimulant research, but it had no commercial application, no clear advantage over existing drugs. It might have stayed that way forever. But then, Europe began preparing for war, and suddenly everyone became very interested in compounds that could make human beings perform beyond their natural limits. By the mid-1930s, pharmaceutical companies across Europe and North America were engaged in an arms race of a different kind, chemical innovation. In Germany, the pharmaceutical firm Temmler-Werke was searching for compounds that could treat depression and fatigue. The economic devastation of the Weimar Republic had created a population struggling with what we'd now call widespread mental health crises. Doctors needed solutions. In 1937, Temmler synthesized methamphetamine in commercial quantities for the first time. They branded it with a clean, clinical name that sounded like aspirin or penicillin, drugs that saved lives. Pervitin. It was marketed not as a dangerous experimental stimulant, but as a miracle of modern medicine. Advertisements appeared in medical journals showing well-dressed professionals taking small, white tablets. The messaging was careful, respectable, authoritative. For depression, for fatigue, for enhanced concentration. By 1938, Pervitin was available over the counter in German pharmacies. No prescription required. Housewives bought it to manage demanding households. Factory workers took it to meet production quotas. Students used it to study through the night. It was sold in chocolate form for easy consumption. Doctors prescribed it freely because the medical establishment endorsed it. The German Medical Association saw no cause for concern. Initial reports showed patients feeling more energized, more focused, more capable. Side effects seemed minimal, perhaps some insomnia, perhaps some appetite suppression, but nothing alarming. Across the Atlantic, American pharmaceutical companies watched with interest. Smith, Klein, and French began producing their own version, Benzedrine. Different branding, same compound family. It was marketed for narcolepsy, depression, chronic fatigue. The FDA, still in its regulatory infancy, approved it without hesitation. In medical literature from 1936 to 1939, methamphetamine and its chemical cousins were discussed in the same clinical tones as antibiotics and antiseptics. Peer-reviewed journals published studies on optimal dosing. Medical conferences included presentations on therapeutic applications. No one used words like addiction or epidemic. The compound had successfully made the leap from ancient plant to isolated molecule to commercial pharmaceutical. It sat in medicine cabinets next to aspirin and cough syrup. Doctors trusted it. Patients benefited. Companies profited. The equilibrium seemed perfect. What no one outside military research facilities knew was that parallel experiments were already underway. Experiments that had nothing to do with treating depression or fatigue, and everything to do with creating soldiers who didn't need sleep, didn't feel fear, and didn't question orders. Picture a German pharmacy in 1938. Clean white walls, shelves organized by category. The pharmacist in a pressed coat, measuring pills into small brown bottles. Behind the counter, boxes of Pervitin stacked neatly beside aspirin and bismuth tablets. A mother comes in. She's exhausted. 3 children, a husband working long shifts at the factory, a household to manage without modern conveniences. The pharmacist knows her. She's a regular customer. He recommends Pervitin without hesitation. Just 1 tablet in the morning. It will help. She takes the bottle, pays, goes home. For the next 3 weeks, she cleans more efficiently than she ever has. Laundry, cooking, childcare, all of it feels manageable, even easy. She has energy left over at the end of the day. Her husband notices. Her neighbors notice. She tells them about the miracle pills. They buy their own bottles. This scene repeated thousands of times across Germany, across Europe, across America, as similar products entered markets. It seemed harmless because it was legal. It seemed safe because doctors prescribed it. It seemed normal because everyone was doing it. In universities, students crammed for exams with Benzedrine. In offices, salesmen used it to maintain enthusiasm during long days. In hospitals, night shift nurses took it to stay alert. The texture of daily life in the late 1930s included casual stimulant use, the same way the 21st century includes casual caffeine use. No one was injecting it, no one was smoking it. No one was cooking it in basement labs or buying it from dealers in dark alleys. It came in clean pharmaceutical packaging with dosage instructions and manufacturer guarantees. The plant that had existed for 5,000 years in relative obscurity had been transformed into a product of modern medicine, controlled, measured, sanitized. Science had tamed something ancient and made it useful. At least, that's what the advertisements claimed. What those clean pharmacy shelves didn't show, what the respectable medical journals didn't publish, what the pharmaceutical companies didn't advertise, were the reports beginning to accumulate in military research facilities. Reports about soldiers. Reports about performance. Reports about what happens when you give methamphetamine not to tired housewives taking one tablet in the morning, but to young men in combat taking handfuls of tablets across days without sleep. Those reports were classified. And in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the world would discover why. September 3rd, 1939, 4:45 a.m. German forces crossed the Polish border at multiple points simultaneously. Within hours, the world witnessed something unprecedented in military history. An army moving faster than defensive lines could respond. Panzer divisions advanced 60 kilometers in a single day, distances that should have been impossible, given the logistics of fuel, supplies, and human endurance. Tank crews fought for 48 hours straight, without rest. Infantry units marched through the night, engaged in combat at dawn, and kept marching. Luftwaffe pilots flew mission after mission with turnaround times that defied conventional human capacity. The world had a name for it: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Military analysts studied the tactics in awe. Newspapers published diagrams of the rapid advances. Historians would spend decades analyzing the strategic genius of the Wehrmacht's operational doctrine, the integration of armor, infantry, and air support, the speed of decision-making, the aggressive tempo. What they didn't know, what wouldn't be revealed until captured documents surfaced after the war, was that the Blitzkrieg had a pharmaceutical foundation. Inside sealed Wehrmacht supply trucks, alongside ammunition and rations, were boxes containing millions of Pervitin tablets. The drug that German housewives took for energy, that students took for concentration, was now being distributed to the entire German military on an industrial scale. But the dosing was different. Not one tablet in the morning, 3 tablets, 6 tablets. Handfuls distributed before major operations. Tank commanders kept personal supplies. Pilots received them before night missions. Infantry platoons were issued them before assaults. A panzer commander named Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning novelist, wrote letters home during the invasion of Poland describing the pills. "It's hard for you to understand, but I'm doing fine. I'll send some of the stuff home for you and Mama. Today I'm writing on Pervitin." In another letter, "Perhaps it's pretty irresponsible to write to you with my mind under the influence of the pills." What Böll and tens of thousands of other German soldiers didn't fully understand was that they weren't just fighting for the Third Reich. They were test subjects in the largest stimulant experiment in human history. Wehrmacht Medical Corps documented every phase. They recorded optimal dosages. They tracked combat performance. They noted side effects in careful clinical language. Initially, the results seemed miraculous. Soldiers did perform beyond normal human limits. They stayed awake for days. They maintained focus under conditions that should have broken them. The early victories in Poland, then in France, seemed to validate the strategy. Tank crews drove through 3 nights without sleep and remained combat effective. Pilots flew sortie after sortie with reaction times that shouldn't have been possible. Infantry advanced faster than Allied forces could retreat. The speed of the German advance wasn't just tactical genius, it was chemistry. By 1940, during the invasion of France, Wehrmacht medical records show that 35 million Pervitin tablets were distributed to Army and Air Force personnel. 35 million in a single campaign. That's not treating fatigue. That's industrial-scale chemical enhancement of military capacity. And here's the first great deception, the first twist in this story that would repeat for the next 80 years. When the world looked at the German military success in 1939 and 1940, they saw technological superiority and strategic brilliance. They analyzed tank designs and communication systems and officer training. They didn't see the pills. The pharmaceutical advantage was invisible, hidden in plain sight, documented in military medical files that would remain classified for decades. Allied intelligence knew something was happening. Captured German soldiers sometimes had Pervitin in their packs, but the full scope, the systematic distribution, the millions of doses remained obscured. So when the world tried to understand how Germany conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years, they missed a critical variable. They missed the fact that the Wehrmacht was fighting a chemically accelerated war, and they missed what was about to happen to those soldiers when the pills ran out. If you're starting to see where this goes, you need to subscribe to 12 AM Historian. This is just the beginning. Over 60 minutes left, and it gets darker. By late 1940, Wehrmacht medical officers began filing reports that never made it into official victory announcements. Reports of soldiers collapsing during routine operations, reports of cardiac incidents among previously healthy young men, reports of violent outbursts within units, soldiers attacking their own comrades without provocation, reports of hallucinations during combat operations. One military physician, Dr. Otto Ranke, who had initially championed Pervitin's use, began documenting disturbing patterns. In a report dated November 1940, he noted, "Soldiers are experiencing complete psychological disintegration after prolonged use. Aggressive behavior, paranoid ideation, and cardiovascular collapse are becoming common." His recommendation: immediate restriction of Pervitin distribution. The recommendation was filed, acknowledged, and ignored, because the Wehrmacht had a problem. The early victories had been won, yes, but now they faced occupation duty, partisan resistance, and preparation for the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. They needed soldiers who could patrol through nights, who could suppress resistance without hesitation, who could maintain vigilance across thousands of kilometers of occupied territory. They needed the pills. So distribution continued, but now with something new. Official recognition of the risks, paired with a calculated decision to proceed anyway. This is where the story shifts, from accidental consequence to institutional crime. German military leadership knew that Pervitin was destroying soldiers. They had medical documentation. They had psychiatric reports. They had casualty data clearly linking stimulant use to cardiac deaths and psychological breakdowns, and they distributed it anyway. By 1941, as Germany prepared for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Pervitin production ramped up again. New contracts with Temla-Werke, increased manufacturing capacity, larger supply shipments to frontline units. The reports of side effects continued. Soldiers writing letters home described symptoms they couldn't understand. Inability to sleep even when exhausted, heart palpitations, sudden rage, paranoia, visual distortions. One soldier wrote, "I see things that aren't there. My hands shake constantly, but they keep giving us the pills, so I keep taking them." Another, "3 of my unit died last week, not from combat. Their hearts just stopped." These weren't anomalies. These were patterns. Wehrmacht Medical Corps compiled statistics that should have ended the program immediately. Estimated 10 to 20% of regular Pervitin users developing severe dependency cardiac incidents, increasing by 300% among stimulant-using units, compared to non-using units. Psychotic breaks occurring at rates high enough to impact unit cohesion. The data was clear. The chemistry was working exactly as it was designed to work, providing short-term performance enhancement followed by severe physical and psychological deterioration. But stopping the program would mean admitting that Germany's early military success had been partially pharmaceutical, not purely the result of superior tactics and German discipline. It would mean admitting that tens of thousands of soldiers were now dependent on a substance their own government had given them. It would mean acknowledging that the Wehrmacht had conducted an unsanctioned mass medical experiment on its own troops. So the official position became, Pervitin is safe when used properly. Side effects are the result of misuse. Soldiers must follow dosing guidelines that were impossible to follow in combat conditions. Guidelines that field commanders ignored when they needed their men to keep fighting. Guidelines that meant nothing when the Eastern Front turned into a nightmare of endless combat across endless distances. Across the Atlantic, US military intelligence was paying very close attention. By 1941, American analysts had access to captured Wehrmacht supply manifests. They'd interrogated prisoners of war who described the pills. They'd recovered medical documents from occupied positions. The American military faced a strategic problem. If they entered the war, they'd be sending troops into combat against an enemy that was chemically enhanced. That's a tactical disadvantage. But they faced an ethical question too. If the Germans were damaging their own soldiers with these drugs, should America replicate that system? The ethical question lasted approximately 3 months. By early 1942, after Pearl Harbor forced America into the war, the US military made its decision. If German soldiers could fight for 72 hours without sleep, American soldiers needed the same capacity. The drug was already available. Smith, Klein, and French had been producing benzedrine, chemically similar to methamphetamine, since the 1930s. Other pharmaceutical companies could ramp up production quickly. The US Army Air Force began issuing Go pills to bomber crews. B-17 pilots flying 8-hour missions over Germany received amphetamine tablets as standard equipment. The pills were in the flight kits, right next to oxygen masks and navigation tools. The Navy distributed them to sailors on submarine duty, where alertness during long patrols could mean the difference between survival and torpedoing. In the Pacific Theater, where jungle warfare created conditions of constant stress and irregular sleep, infantry units received stimulant supplies as routinely as they received rations. The distribution was quieter than Germany's program, more carefully controlled, officially voluntary, described in medical rather than military terms. But the scale was comparable. Between 1942 and 1945, American pharmaceutical companies produced approximately 200 million amphetamine tablets for military use. 200 million. That's enough for every American service member to have received dozens of doses. And just like the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, US military physicians began documenting side effects, behavioral changes, paranoia, cardiac stress, difficulty distinguishing between threats and civilians, impaired judgment, inability to sleep even when off duty, withdrawal symptoms, dependency. One Army psychiatrist stationed in the Pacific wrote in a 1944 report, "The men are not recovering normally between combat operations. Stimulant use appears to be creating a state of sustained physiological stress that prevents proper psychological processing of trauma." His report was classified. Because by 1944, with the war reaching its climax, the question wasn't whether the drugs were harmful. Everyone knew they were harmful. The question was whether winning the war was worth the cost of what these drugs were doing to young men who'd been drafted to fight. And the answer, never stated officially, but clear in every supply shipment, every medical authorization, every classified report that acknowledged harm and authorized continued distribution, was yes. Victory was worth it. The soldiers would have to deal with the consequences later. This pattern, government distribution, documented harm, continued use anyway, repeats throughout this story. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian to see how deep this goes. By 1945, when the war ended, 3 major military powers had conducted essentially the same experiment. Germany, mass stimulant distribution, documented severe side effects, continued distribution despite evidence of harm. Japan, we'll get there next chapter. Industrial-scale methamphetamine production, civilian and military distribution, complete disregard for dependency evidence. United States, controlled but widespread amphetamine use, careful documentation of harms, authorization for continued use anyway. 3 different governments, 3 different military structures, 3 different official justifications. Identical outcomes, tens of thousands of chemically dependent soldiers, documented medical harm, and official policies that prioritized military performance over individual health. This wasn't coincidence. This was the predictable result of a simple equation. Military necessity, plus available chemical enhancement, plus willingness to externalize costs onto soldiers, institutionalized drug distribution. Here's what makes this the crucial turning point in methamphetamine's history. Before WWII, the compound was a pharmaceutical product with limited use. After WWII, it had been validated as a tool for pushing human performance beyond natural limits. Governments had proven that you could chemically enhance large populations for specific purposes. They'd developed distribution systems, they'd established dosing protocols, they'd created manufacturing capacity. Most importantly, they'd normalized the idea that under certain conditions, war, national emergency, strategic necessity, it was acceptable to give people drugs that you knew would harm them. The war ended. The soldiers came home. But the drug didn't go away. The manufacturing capacity remained. The pharmaceutical companies that had produced millions of tablets didn't shut down their operations. The doctors who'd prescribed stimulants to soldiers returned to civilian practice with the same prescription pads. And the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who'd been given these drugs in combat and told they were safe, who'd developed dependencies they didn't understand, who'd been chemically altered by their own governments. They returned to civilian life with no support system, no treatment infrastructure, no acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Some managed, many didn't. In VA hospitals across America in 1946 and 1947, doctors began seeing a pattern. Veterans seeking prescriptions for the same stimulants they'd received in service, claiming they couldn't function without them, exhibiting withdrawal symptoms, unable to sleep, unable to focus, unable to return to normal life. The VA had no protocol for this. The word addiction wasn't used. These were war heroes, not drug addicts. So doctors prescribed what the veterans asked for, and the cycle continued. But America's post-war stimulant problem would pale in comparison to what was unfolding simultaneously in Japan, where military methamphetamine production hadn't just continued after the war. It had exploded into civilian markets, creating the world's first modern drug epidemic. That's next. While German and American military stimulant programs operated with at least some medical oversight, some pretense of controlled distribution, some acknowledgement of risk. Japan took methamphetamine to a place no nation had gone before: industrial, systematic, totalitarian. In 1941, as Japan expanded its war across the Pacific, the imperial government didn't just authorize methamphetamine production. They nationalized it, made it a strategic resource equivalent to steel, oil, and ammunition. The drug was branded under two primary names, Hiropon and Philipon. The marketing was brilliant in its deception. Hiropon, derived from the Greek Philipponos, meaning love of labor. The drug that makes you love work. The drug that turns exhaustion into enthusiasm. The perfect pharmaceutical for an empire demanding total sacrifice from its population. By 1942, Japanese pharmaceutical companies were producing methamphetamine at scales that dwarfed anything in Germany or America. Not millions of tablets, hundreds of millions. And the distribution wasn't limited to soldiers. Factory workers received mandatory doses. Munitions plant employees, many of them teenagers, were given Hiropon to maintain 16-hour shifts. Coal miners, shipyard laborers, textile workers, railway operators. If your job was essential to the war effort, you received pills. Children as young as 14 working in weapons factories were given methamphetamine to meet production quotas. Read that again. The Imperial Japanese government was systematically drugging children to increase industrial output. This wasn't medical treatment. This wasn't even military necessity in the traditional sense. This was the conversion of an entire civilian economy into a chemically accelerated machine designed to sustain total war indefinitely. In cities like Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo, you could walk into any pharmacy and purchase Hiropon over the counter. No prescription, no questions. It was advertised in newspapers alongside soap and rice. Posters showed smiling workers, productive families, the promise of boundless energy. The reality in those factories was very different. Workers collapsing mid-shift from cardiac arrest, psychotic episodes on production floors, fights breaking out over nothing, people grinding their teeth until they fractured, hallucinations during precision machinery operation. And still, the distribution continued. By 1943, internal government health reports documented what was happening. Ministry of Health officials compiled data showing addiction rates exceeding 30% in some industrial facilities, workplace accidents increasing 250% in Hiropon-using factories, psychiatric hospitalizations skyrocketing, cardiac deaths among workers under 25 rising sharply. The reports reached senior government officials. They were read, acknowledged, filed, production quotas increased. What comes next is worse than what you've already heard. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian. You need to see the full picture. In 1943, Dr. Seisaku Hayashi, a physician working for the Ministry of Health, submitted a confidential report to the imperial government. The document, recovered by American occupation forces in 1946 and declassified in 2003, contains language that is difficult to read without feeling physical revulsion. His report, titled Observations on Sustained Hiropon Distribution in Industrial Settings, included these findings. Long-term consumption of methamphetamine results in severe physiological dependency in approximately 60–70% of subjects. Withdrawal symptoms include complete inability to perform labor, severe depression, and in approximately 15% of cases, suicide ideation or attempt. Cardiac complications appear in roughly 40% of regular users within 18 months. Fatalities from heart failure are occurring at statistically significant rates. Psychological deterioration manifests as paranoid thinking, aggressive behavior, and in severe cases, complete psychotic break from reality. Recovery rates are poor. Dr. Hayashi's recommendation section is even more damning. Immediate cessation of public distribution is medically necessary. The long-term health consequences to the civilian population will be catastrophic and irreversible. The response from the Ministry of Munitions came 6 weeks later. The reply was written by Vice Minister Nobusuke Kishi, a man who would later, incredibly, become Prime Minister of Japan in the 1950s. His response, preserved in the same declassified file. The concerns raised by Dr. Hayashi are acknowledged. However, current production demands supersede individual health considerations. Hiropon distribution will continue at current levels. Productivity targets are non-negotiable. Read those sentences again. Individual health considerations. That's bureaucratic language for, we know this is killing people. We're doing it anyway. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't speculation. This is a documented exchange between government health officials and government industry officials, with one side saying, this is causing mass harm, and the other side saying, we don't care. Nobusuke Kishi, the man who authorized continued mass methamphetamine distribution, despite explicit medical warnings of catastrophic harm, was never charged with any crime. After the war, he was imprisoned briefly by American occupation forces as a suspected war criminal, then released. By 1957, he was Prime Minister. The man who wrote Individual Health Considerations as a justification for drugging an entire civilian population reached the highest political office in Japan. Let that sink in. But Kishi wasn't the only official who knew. The documentary record shows that by 1944, awareness of Hiropon's devastating effects had reached the highest levels of Japanese government. The Ministry of Health had compiled hundreds of reports. The Ministry of Welfare documented mass addiction in industrial cities. Military physicians reported psychotic breaks among kamikaze pilots, who were given massive doses before missions. Police departments documented surge in methamphetamine-related violence. Every level of government knew, and every level of government continued distribution. Because stopping would mean admitting that Japan's industrial capacity, its ability to continue the war, was partially dependent on mass drugging of its own population. It would mean millions of dependent workers suddenly unable to function. It would mean production collapse at a moment when American forces were closing in. So the official policy became ignore the casualties, suppress the reports, maintain the distribution, win the war first, deal with consequences later. Except Japan didn't win the war, and the consequences didn't wait. The most disturbing application of methamphetamine in Imperial Japan was reserved for the kamikaze program. Beginning in October 1944, as Japan faced inevitable defeat, the military launched organized suicide attacks using pilots who would deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. The psychological challenge was obvious. How do you get young men to fly to certain death without hesitation, without last-minute doubt, without the survival instinct taking over? Chemistry provided an answer. Kamikaze pilots were given extreme doses of methamphetamine before their final flights, often 10-20 times the standard military dose. The goal wasn't sustained wakefulness or improved performance. The goal was complete dissociation from reality and erasure of fear. Lieutenant Toshio Yoshitake, one of the few kamikaze pilots who survived, his plane malfunctioned and he was rescued, described the experience in a 1983 interview. They gave us pills before the mission. We were told they were vitamins. Within 30 minutes, I felt nothing. No fear, no sadness, no hesitation. I was ready to die without question. When my plane failed and I survived, the shame was unbearable. But looking back now, I realize I wasn't in my right mind. None of us were. They drugged us into suicide. By war's end, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in suicide attacks. We'll never know exactly how many were flying under the influence of massive methamphetamine doses, but military medical records suggest it was standard protocol. Think about that. The Japanese government was using methamphetamine to chemically engineer young men into weapons, to override their survival instincts, to make suicide feel acceptable, to convert human beings into guided missiles. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't even military enhancement. This was pharmaceutical mind control used to facilitate state-sponsored mass suicide. And when the war ended in August 1945, with cities destroyed and an empire collapsed, the infrastructure for this industrial drug distribution didn't disappear. It just lost its government supervision. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. Within weeks, American occupation forces began documenting something they weren't prepared for: a drug crisis of unprecedented scale. Japanese pharmaceutical companies still had massive stockpiles of methamphetamine. Military warehouses contained millions of unused tablets. Production facilities were intact. And most critically, millions of civilians and demobilized soldiers were severely, physically dependent on a drug they'd been given by their own government. What happened next was predictable and devastating. With government distribution ended, but dependency unresolved, methamphetamine flooded Japan's black markets. Former military supplies were sold on street corners. Factory workers who'd been given mandatory doses for years suddenly had to buy from illegal dealers to avoid withdrawal. The drug that had been packaged in clean pharmaceutical bottles with government seals was now sold in back alleys by Yakuza gangs who'd seized the surplus supplies. Prices collapsed. At its peak, methamphetamine in post-war Japan was cheaper than rice, more accessible than vegetables. A starving, defeated population turned to a drug that erased hunger, erased despair, erased the psychological devastation of total defeat. By 1946, U.S. occupation authorities estimated that approximately 5% of Japan's entire population, roughly 5.5 million people, were using methamphetamine regularly. 5.5 million. In a single country. In a single year. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to the entire population of modern-day Singapore, or more than the current population of Ireland, all using meth simultaneously. Japanese hospitals were overwhelmed. Psychiatric wards, designed for hundreds, now held thousands. Patients experiencing amphetamine psychosis, paranoid delusions, violent hallucinations, complete detachment from reality, filled every available bed. Dr. Masao Yamada, working at Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital in 1947, kept a journal that was later published. His entries are harrowing. March 14, 1947, admitted 23 patients today exhibiting methamphetamine psychosis. We have no space, no medication that helps. They scream about enemies that don't exist. They attack staff. They cannot sleep. Their bodies are destroying themselves. Many will never recover. April 3, 1947. A woman was brought in today who had not slept in 11 days. Her heart was beating 180 times per minute. She died within hours. She was 19 years old. She told me before she died that she'd started taking Hiropon at the factory when she was 15. The government gave it to her. She never understood it was dangerous. The human cost was staggering. Between 1945 and 1954, approximately 60,000 Japanese citizens died from methamphetamine-related causes. Cardiac failure, suicide during psychosis, overdose, malnutrition. Tens of thousands more suffered permanent psychiatric damage. Children were born to dependent mothers, entering the world already experiencing withdrawal. Crime rates exploded as desperate users stole to buy drugs they'd been given free by the government months earlier. The Yakuza, seeing opportunity in chaos, built the first modern drug trafficking networks. They established production facilities, created distribution chains, recruited dealers. The black market infrastructure they built in 1945 to 1950 would serve as the template for organized drug trafficking worldwide. But here's the most damning fact. This was entirely predictable. Every single consequence was documented in the medical reports that government officials had read and ignored during the war. Dr. Hayashi had warned of catastrophic and irreversible harm to the civilian population. His prediction was precise. His timeline was accurate. His recommendation, immediate cessation, had been dismissed because productivity mattered more than health. Now, with the war lost and productivity irrelevant, the entire civilian population was paying the price for decisions made by officials who never faced consequences. The American occupation government, to its credit, eventually responded with force. In 1951, Japan passed the Stimulant Control Law, criminalizing methamphetamine possession and production. Police conducted massive raids. Pharmaceutical companies were forced to destroy remaining stockpiles. By 1954, the first wave of Japan's methamphetamine epidemic was largely controlled. But the cost was already paid. 5.5 million people had been dependent. Tens of thousands were dead. Hundreds of thousands suffered permanent damage. Entire families were destroyed. Children grew up with parents lost to psychosis or prison, and the officials who'd authorized the original distribution. The ones who'd read the medical warnings and written productivity targets are non-negotiable. Most lived comfortably into old age. Several, like Nobusuke Kishi, reached positions of significant post-war power. Japan's epidemic was the first. It wasn't the last. If you're not subscribed to 12 AM Historian yet, do it now. This pattern repeats across the next 40 years. The year is 1950. America is 5 years out from victory. The economy is booming. Suburbs are sprawling. The future looks bright, and millions of Americans are taking methamphetamine prescribed by their family doctors. While Japan was drowning in its black market epidemic, American pharmaceutical companies were conducting their own mass distribution experiment. This one legal, sanctioned, and heavily marketed. The pitch was seductive. Lose weight effortlessly. Fight depression without therapy. Stay energized through busy days. Be a better mother, employee, student, citizen. Just take a pill. Smith, Klein and French marketed their methamphetamine product under the brand name Desoxin. Abbott Laboratories sold Obitrol, which would later become Adderall after reformulation. Burroughs Wellcome produced Methedrine. These weren't obscure drugs hidden in medical journals. These were mainstream pharmaceuticals advertised in Life magazine, Good Housekeeping, and Ladies' Home Journal. One 1952 advertisement showed a smiling housewife surrounded by sparkling clean appliances, children, and her husband arriving home to a perfect dinner. The caption, "Desoxin, when life demands more than you can give." Another, from 1958, showed a businesswoman at a desk with text reading, "For the woman who needs to excel at work and home, Obitrol provides the energy to do both." The ads never said methamphetamine. They used the clean pharmaceutical names, the respectable brand identities. Doctors prescribed them freely because the FDA had approved them. The FDA approved them because pharmaceutical companies submitted studies showing they were safe for short-term use. What those studies didn't show, what the pharmaceutical companies didn't emphasize, was that short-term use quickly became long-term dependency for hundreds of thousands of patients. By 1958, American doctors were writing approximately 8 to 10 million prescriptions annually for methamphetamine-based weight loss drugs alone. That doesn't include prescriptions for depression, narcolepsy, attention disorders, or chronic fatigue. Millions of Americans, mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly suburban, were using methamphetamine daily under medical supervision. The drug that had destroyed Japanese factory workers was now being sold to American housewives as a lifestyle enhancement. And for nearly 15 years, it worked perfectly. Or seemed to. Patients did lose weight. They did feel more energetic. They did accomplish more in their days. Pharmaceutical companies made hundreds of millions of dollars. Doctors received glowing testimonials from patients who felt the drugs had transformed their lives. But then the cracks started showing. Patients couldn't stop taking the medication without extreme fatigue. They'd start with 1 pill daily, then 2, then 4. Doctors noticed patterns. Tolerance building, dosage creeping upward, patients becoming irritable and anxious when pills were delayed. By the early 1960s, medical journals began publishing case studies, cautious at first, hesitant to accuse. But the data was becoming impossible to ignore. A 1962 study in the Journal of the American Medical Association documented 203 patients who'd been prescribed methamphetamine for weight loss. After 18 months, 68% had developed tolerance requiring increased doses, 41% exhibited signs of psychological dependency, 23% experienced paranoid symptoms, 80% suffered complete psychotic breaks requiring hospitalization. The study concluded carefully. Long-term prescription of methamphetamine compounds may carry significant risks that warrant further investigation. Further investigation, not immediate restriction, not emergency recall, not warning labels. Further investigation. Because stopping would mean admitting that pharmaceutical companies had been distributing an addictive stimulant to millions of people without adequate safety monitoring. It would mean acknowledging that the FDA had approved drugs based on insufficient long-term data. It would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that America's medical establishment had learned nothing from Japan's disaster. Or worse, had learned from it, and proceeded anyway, because the profit margins were too attractive to refuse. So the official position became, the drug is safe when properly prescribed. Problems are due to patient misuse or pre-existing conditions. Doctors need better education on appropriate prescribing practices. The distribution continued. By 1970, 20 years after prescription methamphetamine flooded American medicine, the FDA finally began restricting its use. Not banning it, restricting it. Even today, in 2024, Desoxin remains FDA approved for ADHD and obesity treatment, though prescriptions are now rare. But the damage from 1950 to 1970 had already been done. An estimated 2 to 3 million Americans developed dependencies on prescription methamphetamine during that period. Many never understood they'd been addicted to the same drug they'd later see demonized in anti-drug campaigns. Here's where the story becomes even darker. While white suburban housewives received desoxyn prescriptions from family doctors, another version of methamphetamine use was emerging in America, and it was being treated very, very differently. By the 1960s, illicit methamphetamine production had begun in underground labs, primarily in California. The drug was called speed, or crank on the streets. Chemically identical to desoxyn, molecularly identical, the same compound. But the users were different. Street methamphetamine use was concentrated in working-class communities, among truckers needing to drive long hauls, among laborers working double shifts, among marginalized populations seeking escape or energy to survive poverty. The user base included significant numbers of Black Americans, Latino Americans, and poor white Americans. And suddenly, methamphetamine wasn't a medical treatment anymore. It was a criminal problem. The statistics from this period are damning. In 1965, white women receiving prescription methamphetamine, approximately 5.2 million arrests for prescription methamphetamine misuse, fewer than 3,000 nationally legal consequences. Usually diverted to treatment, prescriptions revoked working-class users arrested for illicit methamphetamine possession. Approximately 14,000 conviction rate, 87%. Average sentence, 2 5 years. Same drug, same chemical, same potential for harm and addiction. Completely different legal consequences based entirely on who was using it and how they obtained it. Studies from the period show that usage rates of illicit stimulants were roughly equal across racial demographics when controlling for income. But arrest rates told a different story. Black Americans were arrested for methamphetamine possession at rates 3.8 times higher than white Americans, despite comparable usage rates. Latino Americans were arrested at rates 3.2 times higher than white Americans. In California specifically, where both prescription methamphetamine use and illicit speed use were common, the disparity was even starker. In wealthy Orange County suburbs, prescription methamphetamine use estimated at 8 to 12% of adult women. Police made virtually no arrests. Doctors faced no criminal liability. In East Los Angeles, estimated methamphetamine use 6 to 9% of adults. Police made thousands of arrests annually. Users faced felony charges routinely. Let me contextualize these numbers. 26 million Americans were arrested for drug offenses between 1965 and 1990. 26 million. That's more than the current population of Australia. The vast majority of these arrests were for simple possession, not dealing, not manufacturing, just having drugs. And here's the specific methamphetamine data. Between 1970 and 1990, approximately 4.2 million Americans were arrested specifically for methamphetamine or amphetamine-related offenses. That's one arrest every 90 seconds for 2 decades. Studies consistently showed that white Americans and Black Americans used illicit stimulants at nearly identical rates. Approximately 6 to 8% of each population reporting use in anonymous surveys. Yet Black Americans comprised 47% of those arrested for methamphetamine offenses, despite being only 12% of the population. Do the math. That's roughly 4 times more likely to be arrested for the same behavior. The system gave law enforcement the tools and the justification for aggressive policing of Black and Latino communities. Methamphetamine was the low-hanging fruit, the easiest charge to bring, the simplest way to feed the growing prison industrial complex that was exploding across America in the 1970s and 1980s. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies were still profiting from prescription methamphetamine sales. Doctors were still prescribing it. The FDA was still approving it. The drug that middle-class white women took to lose weight faced minimal legal consequences. The drug that working-class black men used to work double shifts could destroy their entire lives with a single felony conviction. The racial disparities in civilian methamphetamine enforcement became even more tragic when you examine what was happening to soldiers in Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1973, the US military distributed amphetamines and methamphetamine to combat troops on a scale that rivaled WWII, and with even less oversight. The Vietnam War was different from previous conflicts. No clear front lines, constant guerrilla threat, extended jungle patrols where sleep could mean death, psychological warfare that never stopped. Amphetamines became standard issue. Field medics carried them. Unit commanders distributed them before night operations. Soldiers called them pep pills or bennies. Official designation: combat fatigue medication. By 1971, military medical records show that approximately 20% of combat troops in Vietnam had used amphetamines or methamphetamine during their deployment. Some used them occasionally, a pill before a dangerous patrol. Others used them constantly, daily doses, just to function in an environment of perpetual stress. And just like WWII, just like Japan, military physicians documented the consequences. One 1970 report from Army Medical Corps psychiatrists stationed at Long Binh noted, "Stimulant use among troops is correlated with increased incidence of inappropriate violence, impaired decision-making under stress, and difficulty reintegrating into non-combat routines. Dependency appears to develop rapidly. Withdrawal symptoms are severe." The report was classified. Soldiers returned home, many of them black and Latino men who'd been drafted disproportionately, carrying dependencies they'd developed under direct military supervision. Young men who'd been given pills by army medics found themselves arrested by civilian police for possessing the same drugs months after returning home. The VA system was unprepared and underfunded. Treatment programs didn't exist. The word addiction wasn't applied to veterans. It implied weakness, not medical reality. So thousands of Vietnam veterans with service-connected stimulant dependencies ended up in the criminal justice system instead of treatment facilities. Specific case example from VA records. Names changed. Harold Jenkins, black veteran, Army infantry, Purple Heart recipient. Given amphetamines regularly during 1968-1969. Vietnam deployment, returned home with severe dependency. Arrested in 1970 for methamphetamine possession in Detroit. Sentenced to 5 years. Served 3 VA benefits never mentioned in trial. No treatment offered Curtis Washington, Latino veteran, Marine Corps. Used methamphetamine during extended jungle patrols. Documented PTSD and substance dependency in military medical records. Arrested in 1972 in Los Angeles for possession. Sentenced to 7 years under California's harsh drug laws. Military service considered irrelevant by judge. Meanwhile, Richard Morrison, white veteran from Connecticut. Similar service record, similar documented stimulant use, arrested in 1971 for possession case, diverted to treatment program. No prison time served, successfully obtained VA benefits, same military service, same drug use patterns, radically different outcomes based primarily on race and geography. The government that had fed them pills in rice paddies was now arresting them for possession in their hometowns. And the cruelty of it, the specific, intentional cruelty, was that the evidence of military-induced dependency was right there in their service records. But prosecutors and judges either didn't care or actively dismissed it. This isn't ancient history. These patterns continue today. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian. The next 30 minutes show you how this system evolved into what we have now. While millions of Americans were being arrested, imprisoned, and branded as criminals for methamphetamine use, the pharmaceutical companies that had mass-produced and aggressively marketed the drug faced almost no consequences. Let's name names. Smith, Klein and French, SKF, produced disoxin and benzedrine from the 1930s through 1980s. Internal documents revealed in later lawsuits show company researchers warned of addiction potential as early as 1946. Warnings were suppressed in marketing materials. Company continued advertising methamphetamine for weight loss until 1979. Total estimated revenue from methamphetamine products, 1945 to 1980, $847 million, equivalent to $3.7 billion in 2024 dollars. Criminal charges filed against executives. 0 civil penalties paid, approximately $2 million in scattered settlements, 0.2% of profits. Abbott Laboratories produced Obitrol from 1960-1973. Marketing specifically targeted busy mothers and career women. 1962 internal memo, discovered during discovery in a 1990s lawsuit, acknowledged that tolerance and dependency develop in significant percentage of users beyond 6-month mark. Recommendation in memo. Revise warning labels. Action taken, no change to labels or marketing for 8 years. Total estimated revenue from methamphetamine products. 623 million executives charged. 0 FDA sanctions. 1 warning letter in 1971. No financial penalties. Burroughs Wellcome produced methedrine for intravenous use. Yes, pharmaceutical-grade injectable methamphetamine. Marketed to hospitals for acute fatigue states. By late 1960s, clear evidence that IV methedrine was being widely abused. Company continued production until 1969. Total revenue, 156 million. Legal consequences, none. The pattern is consistent across every pharmaceutical company involved. Company develops and markets methamphetamine product. Company's own researchers identify addiction and harm potential. Warnings are suppressed or minimized. Aggressive marketing continues for years or decades. Millions of Americans develop dependencies. Eventually, mounting medical evidence forces. Reduction in prescribing. Company reformulates drug slightly. Releases it under new brand name. Continues profiting. No executives face criminal liability. No meaningful financial penalties proportional to profits. Company shareholders rewarded throughout. Now compare that to what happened to users during the same period. 42 million arrests for methamphetamine possession, 1970-1990. Average sentence for simple possession, 2 to 5 years. Average sentence for possession with intent, 8 or 12 years. Percentage who are first-time, non-violent offenders. Approximately 71% percentage who received mandatory minimum sentences, 64% after 1986 drug laws. The math is simple and devastating. A pharmaceutical executive who knowingly suppressed addiction data and marketed methamphetamine to millions of people, generating hundreds of millions in profit. No consequences. A single mother arrested with 0.5 grams of methamphetamine for personal use. 5 years in federal prison, loss of custody of children, lifetime felony record preventing employment. loss of voting rights, ineligibility for federal benefits, including student loans and housing assistance. This isn't a failure of justice. This is justice working exactly as designed, to protect capital and punish poverty. By the 1980s, the consequences of 40 years of methamphetamine distribution, first military, then medical, then criminal, had created cascading generational harm. Let's trace one typical pathway. 1945. James, age 19, is drafted and sent to the Pacific. Given amphetamines for combat fatigue, develops dependency, returns home in 1946, unable to function without stimulants. 1947, James seeks help. No addiction treatment available. Begins buying black market methamphetamine to manage what he doesn't understand is dependency. 1949, James marries, has 2 children by 1952, uses methamphetamine to work double shifts supporting family, believes he's being responsible, working hard, providing. 1955, James's usage increases. Mood swings, paranoia, violence at home. His wife doesn't understand what's happening. Neither does he. 1958, James arrested for possession. Sentenced to 3 years. Family collapses. Wife can't work and care for children. They lose housing. 1961, James released. Felony record prevents employment. Returns to methamphetamine use. Spiral accelerates. 1965, James's son, Michael, now 13, grows up in poverty with an absent, addicted father. School struggles. No support system. 1970, Michael, age 18, starts using methamphetamine. Partially genetic predisposition, partially learned behavior, primarily desperation in the same poverty that destroyed his father. 1953, Michael arrested. Judge sees pattern of family criminality. Sentences him to 8 years. 1981, Michael released. His own children now growing up exactly as he did. The cycle repeats. This wasn't one family story. This was hundreds of thousands of families across America, primarily in Black and Latino communities that faced both higher arrest rates and fewer treatment resources. The data on generational impact is staggering. Study from UCAE, published 1989, followed 247 families where a parent was incarcerated for drug offences. Between 1965 to 1975, children of incarcerated parents were 6.2 times more likely to be arrested for drug offences themselves. 73% reported childhood poverty. 61% reported childhood instability, foster care, homelessness, or multiple relocations. 44% did not graduate high school. As adults, average income 58% lower than national median. The prison system became a generational trap. In 1980, 5 from 80,000 Americans incarcerated total, 40% for drug offences. Methamphetamine-related, plus 15% of drug offences. In 1990, 1.15 million Americans incarcerated, doubled in 10 years. 58% for drug offences. Methamphetamine-related, 22% of drug offences. In 2000, 1.94 million Americans incarcerated, 55% for drug offences. Methamphetamine-related, 31% of drug offences. That's millions of people cycled through prison for a drug that pharmaceutical companies had legally distributed to millions more just decades earlier. And the cruelty compounds. A felony drug conviction in most states meant permanent barrier to professional licensing, can't become nurse, teacher, electrician, plumber. Ineligibility for federal student loans, can't go to college. Ineligibility for public housing assistance, can't access stable housing. Ineligibility for SNAP benefits, food stamps in many states. Loss of voting rights, in many states permanently. Barriers to employment. Background checks eliminate most job opportunities. So the path forward after prison was no education access, no professional career, no stable housing, no food assistance, poverty, high likelihood of returning to drug use, re-arrest, longer sentence, deeper poverty, children entering same cycle. This was policy. This was designed. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act and subsequent legislation created mandatory minimum sentences, specifically designed to incarcerate drug users for decades. Politicians called it tough on crime. What it actually was, generational destruction of families and communities, disproportionately affecting Black and Latino Americans, for using a drug that white Americans had been legally prescribed by doctors for the same purposes: weight loss, energy, focus, just years earlier. By the late 1970s, mounting medical evidence finally forced the FDA and DEA to significantly restrict prescription methamphetamine. Doctors could no longer freely prescribe it for weight loss. Pharmacy controls tightened. Production quotas for pharmaceutical companies were slashed. The era of casual prescription methamphetamine was ending. Public health advocates celebrated. The medical establishment acknowledged past mistakes. The media reported it as a victory against dangerous drugs. What nobody adequately prepared for was what happens to millions of people when you suddenly cut off access to a drug they're physiologically dependent on. The patients who'd been taking Dazoxin for 5, 10, 15 years didn't stop needing it just because their doctors stopped prescribing it. Their brains had been chemically altered by long-term use. Stopping abruptly meant severe withdrawal, crushing fatigue, depression, inability to function. Some managed, many didn't. And in the gap between legal supply and untreated dependency, criminal networks saw opportunity. This is the pattern that repeats throughout drug policy history. Step 1. Government or medical system creates mass dependency through military distribution, medical overprescription, or aggressive marketing. Step 2. When harms become undeniable, supply is suddenly restricted. Step 3. Dependent population still exists, now without legal access. Step 4. Criminal networks fill the supply gap. Step 5. Government criminalizes the dependent population. Step 6. Society blames individuals instead of the system that created dependency. This isn't a drug problem. This is a policy failure that gets reframed as individual moral failure. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was about to happen with methamphetamine on a scale that would devastate rural America for the next 40 years. The transformation of methamphetamine from pharmaceutical product to street drug required one key discovery: that the compound could be synthesized from over-the-counter cold medicines containing pseudoephedrine or ephedrine. The chemistry wasn't new. It had been documented in academic literature since the 1960s. But it wasn't widely used because pharmaceutical methamphetamine was relatively easy to obtain through prescription fraud or theft. When prescriptions tightened, enterprising chemists began looking at alternatives, and they found that pseudoephedrine, available in every pharmacy and grocery store in products like Sudafed and Actifed, could be converted to methamphetamine through relatively simple chemical processes. The equipment needed was basic: glass containers, tubing, heat sources, solvents, ether, acetone or similar, and acids or bases for pH adjustment. Total cost for a functional lab, $300, $500. The product was nearly identical to pharmaceutical Dazoxin, same chemical structure, same effects, same addiction potential. But it could be produced anywhere at a fraction of the cost. By 1982, small-scale methamphetamine labs began appearing in rural California, especially Central Valley and desert regions, Oregon and Washington, remote forested areas, rural Midwest, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas particularly, Arkansas and Oklahoma, rural Appalachia. The pattern was consistent: isolated locations, economically depressed regions, areas with minimal law enforcement presence. The early cooks were often motorcycle gang members. Hell's Angels and related groups were heavily involved early. Individuals with some chemistry knowledge, often incomplete, leading to dangerous production methods. Rural residents seeking income in regions with few economic opportunities. One cook from Missouri, interviewed anonymously in a 1995 documentary, described the economics. One box of Sudafed, $8. Some other chemicals, maybe $20. You could produce an ounce of meth that sold for $800 or $1,000. If you knew what you were doing, you could make a batch in 6 to 8 hours. Where I lived, there were no jobs. The factory closed in '79. Half the town was on welfare. Cooking meth was the only way to make real money. The profitability was extraordinary. Drug Enforcement Administration reports from the mid-1980s estimated that a single small lab could produce $5,000 to $10,000 worth of methamphetamine per week with minimal investment. As word spread, labs proliferated exponentially. DEA lab seizure statistics, 1981, 428 labs discovered and seized, 1985, 1,392 labs seized, 1989, 3,847 labs seized, 1995, 10,639 labs seized, 1989, 17,937 labs seized. That's one lab discovered every 30 minutes by 1999, and those were only the ones found. The human cost of this proliferation was immediate and severe. Lab explosions. Methamphetamine production involves highly volatile chemicals. Ether, commonly used, is explosively flammable. Red phosphorus, another common ingredient, is pyrophoric. It can spontaneously ignite. Between 1990 and 2000, there were approximately 3,200 documented lab fires or explosions in the United States, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of severe injuries. Environmental contamination. Each pound of methamphetamine produced generates approximately 5 to 6 pounds of toxic waste. Much of this was simply dumped in rivers, in forests, in abandoned properties. The EPA estimated in 2002 that meth lab cleanup would cost approximately $4 billion for identified sites, with thousands more unidentified. Children in labs. Perhaps most tragic, many cooks operated labs in their homes while children were present. Between 1995 and 2005, Child Protective Services removed approximately 20,000 children from homes where methamphetamine labs were operating. Many of these children showed signs of chemical exposure. Respiratory problems, burns, developmental delays. The drug that had started as an ancient plant, been refined by Japanese chemists, distributed by militaries and pharmaceutical companies, had now metastasized into a cottage industry of dangerous, unregulated production that was poisoning people and places across America. And the purity was increasing while the price was dropping. Street methamphetamine purity, 1980, average 30 to 40% pure. 1990, average 50 to 60% pure. 2000, average 70 to 80% pure. Street methamphetamine price, adjusted for inflation, 1980, $180 per gram, $2024. 1990, $140 per gram, 2000, $90 per gram. Higher purity, lower cost, wider availability. Every prohibition policy had backfired. Instead of reducing harm, restriction had created a thriving criminal economy, producing a more dangerous product with zero quality control. We're approaching the present day, and it gets worse. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian. The final chapters show you where this leads. By the 1990s, emergency rooms across the American Midwest and West began reporting patterns they'd never seen before. Meth mouth, severe tooth decay, often total tooth loss, caused by combination of dry mouth, reduced saliva production, teeth grinding and neglect during extended drug use. Dentists reported seeing 25-year-olds with mouths resembling 80-year-olds. Amphetamine psychosis. Patients presenting with paranoid delusions, auditory and visual hallucinations, violent behavior, clinically indistinguishable from schizophrenia, but caused by methamphetamine use. Unlike cocaine psychosis, which resolves relatively quickly, meth-induced psychosis could persist for months or become permanent. Sudden cardiac death. Young adults, typically late 20s to early 40s, dying suddenly from massive heart attacks or strokes. Autopsies showed hearts with damage consistent with decades of stress compressed into years of methamphetamine use. Extreme malnutrition. The appetite suppression effect of methamphetamine, combined with multi-day binges without eating, created patients with severe vitamin deficiencies, muscle wasting, and organ damage. One ER physician in Springfield, Missouri, described it in a 2001 interview. In 1985, I might see one meth-related case per month. By 1995, I was seeing multiple cases every single shift. The drug had gone from rare to ubiquitous, and the cases were horrifying. People who looked 60 at age 30. People convinced their skin was crawling with insects so they'd scratch themselves bloody. People whose teeth were literally rotting out of their heads. The demographic impact was particularly devastating in small towns across the Midwest and rural West. Places that had no addiction infrastructure, limited mental health resources, and law enforcement agencies with single-digit officer counts. Case study. Oelwein, Iowa. Population Oaxaca 200 and 2000. Between 1995 and 2005. Meth-related arrests increased 940%. Child welfare cases increased 310%. Property crime increased 275%. One meth lab discovered for every 47 residents over 10-year period hospital reported 40-60% of ER visits involved methamphetamine town's economy, already struggling, contracted further as businesses closed and property values collapsed. Oelwein wasn't unique. It was typical. Across rural America, similar patterns emerged. Manufacturing jobs had disappeared in the 1980s and 1990s. Factory closures, NAFTA, automation. Economic despair created conditions for drug use as escape. Methamphetamine was cheap, available, and provided temporary sense of energy and capability. Once established, meth use created its own economy, cooking, dealing, theft to support habits. Law enforcement focused on arrest rather than treatment. Communities spiraled into cycles of addiction, crime, incarceration, family destruction. By 2000, statistics painted a devastating picture. Estimated 1.5 million Americans using methamphetamine regularly. Approximately 12-15% of all inmates in state prisons incarcerated for meth-related offenses. Child welfare systems in affected states reporting 30-50% of cases involving parental meth use. Estimated economic cost $23 billion annually. Healthcare, criminal justice, lost productivity, child welfare, environmental cleanup. And this was before the superlab era, before Mexican cartels industrialized production and flooded the market with unprecedented quantities of ultra-pure methamphetamine. The worst was still coming. Take a step back. Look at the full arc from 1938 to 2000. Phase 1, 1938-1945. Governments distribute methamphetamine to military personnel, create mass dependency, document severe side effects, continue distribution anyway. War ends. Governments abandon dependent soldiers. Phase 2, 1945-1955. Japan experiences first modern meth epidemic as military supplies flood black market. 5.5 million dependent. Tens of thousands dead. Government eventually intervenes, but never accepts responsibility. Phase 3, 1950-1975. American pharmaceutical companies mass produce and aggressively market methamphetamine. Millions of prescriptions, addiction warnings suppressed, companies profit enormously, no executives face consequences. Phase 4, 1965-1975. U.S. military distributes amphetamines in Vietnam. Soldiers develop dependencies, return home, face criminalization instead of treatment. Particularly affects Black and Latino veterans. Phase 5, 1970-1990. Prescription access restricted. Millions of dependent people suddenly cut off. Criminal organizations fill supply gap. Small labs proliferate. Government responds with mass incarceration rather than treatment. Primarily targets Black and Latino communities, despite equal usage rates across races. Phase 6, 1990-2005. Lab production reaches industrial scale. Rural American communities devastated. Children removed from homes. Environmental catastrophe. Government continues criminal justice approach. Treatment remains underfunded. Every phase was predictable from the previous phase. Every policy failure repeated the same mistake, creating or allowing dependency, then criminalizing the dependent. Every intervention prioritized punishment over treatment, incarceration over rehabilitation. And throughout all of it, the people who made decisions that created mass harm, pharmaceutical executives, government officials, policymakers, faced no consequences. While the people who suffered the consequences of those decisions, soldiers given pills, patients prescribed medications, poor communities targeted for enforcement, bore all the costs. This isn't the story of a drug. This is the story of systematic policy failure, corporate malfeasance, and a criminal justice system that was never designed to solve problems, only to punish the people who suffer from them. And we're still not done. Because in the early 2000s, the methamphetamine story took one final devastating turn. By the early 2000s, the methamphetamine crisis had become impossible to ignore. Small-town newspapers ran front-page stories about lab explosions. Emergency rooms published data showing meth-related admissions had increased 500–800% in some regions. Child welfare agencies reported they were overwhelmed. Police departments in rural counties spent 60–70% of their time on meth-related cases. Finally, in 2005, Congress passed the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act as part of the USA Patriot Act reauthorization. The law's primary mechanism was straightforward. Restrict access to pseudoephedrine, the key precursor chemical. Under the new law, products containing pseudoephedrine moved behind pharmacy counters. No more grabbing Sudafed off the shelf. Purchasers required to show government-issued ID purchases logged in federal database quantity limits. 3.6 grams per day, 9 grams per 30-day period. Retailers faced criminal penalties for violations. The pharmaceutical industry opposed it initially, worried about lost sales. But public pressure was overwhelming. The law took effect in 2006. The results were immediate and dramatic. Domestic meth lab seizures, 2005, 12,619 labs seized, 2006, 7,347 labs seized, 42%, 2007, 3,621 labs seized, 71% from peak, 2010, 214 labs seized, 83% from peak, law enforcement celebrated. Politicians held press conferences. The media declared the meth epidemic over. New law closes meth labs across America. New York Times, 2007. Rural communities breathe easier as meth production plummets. USA Today, 2008. Treatment providers reported fewer patients presenting with injuries from lab explosions. Firefighters responded to fewer toxic chemical fires. Child welfare agencies saw declining numbers of children removed from lab environments. For approximately 18 months, it looked like the problem was solved. It wasn't. The 2005 law had successfully destroyed the cottage industry of small domestic labs. But it did absolutely nothing to address the underlying demand for methamphetamine. Millions of Americans were still dependent. The market still existed. The profit potential was still enormous. Restricting precursor chemicals in the United States just meant production would move elsewhere. And criminal organizations were already prepared. While American lawmakers were congratulating themselves on the Combat Meth Epidemic Act, Mexican drug trafficking organizations were quietly revolutionizing methamphetamine production. The small labs in Missouri and Iowa could produce ounces or pounds at a time. The new super labs in Mexico would produce hundreds of pounds per batch. The Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CGNG, invested in industrial-scale operations that bore no resemblance to the amateur operations in rural America. Infrastructure, warehouse-sized facilities in remote areas of Sinaloa, Jalisco, and Michoacán states. Professional chemists, often recruited from legitimate pharmaceutical backgrounds. Industrial-grade equipment. Commercial reactors, professional ventilation. Quality control labs, secure supply chains for precursor chemicals sourced from China, India, and Southeast Asia. Production capacity. Single super lab could produce 50 to 100 pounds of methamphetamine per batch, multiple batches per week. Annual production from one facility, 2,000 to 5,000 plus pounds. Purity levels, consistently 85-95%, higher than pharmaceutical desoxin. Economic scale, production cost per pound, approximately $300-500 wholesale price in US, $3,000-5,000 per pound. Street value, $15,000 to $25,000 per pound. Profit margin, 3,000-8,000%, depending on distribution level. The cartels didn't just replicate American production. They industrialized it, professionalized it, and scaled it to dimensions that made domestic labs look like craft operations. And they solved the precursor problem that American law enforcement thought they'd fixed. Instead of relying on US pseudoephedrine, Mexican operations sourced phenylacetone, P2P, an alternative precursor that wasn't regulated as tightly. P2P could be synthesized from chemicals that were legal, abundant, and globally traded. The P2P method produced a slightly different form of methamphetamine, technically D-methamphetamine, instead of the D-isomer L-isomer mix from pseudoephedrine reduction. The D form was actually more potent than the mixed isomers. By 2008, DEA analysis showed that 80% of methamphetamine seized in the United States was Mexican-produced super lab product. By 2010, it was over 90%. The drug that returned was cheaper. Street prices dropped 40-60% between 2007-2012 as superlab production flooded markets. Purer. Average purity increased from 60-70% domestic small lab era to 85 or 95% superlab era. More available. Distribution networks expanded to regions that hadn't previously seen significant meth presence. Eastern states, southern states, urban centers that had been relatively spared. More addictive. The ultra-high purity and potent D-isomer form created faster dependency and more severe withdrawal. The Combat Meth Epidemic Act had accomplished something, but not what legislators intended. It had eliminated the most dangerous aspect of methamphetamine: exploding domestic labs, children in toxic environments, environmental contamination from amateur production. But it had simultaneously consolidated production in the hands of sophisticated criminal organizations, producing a more dangerous product at industrial scale. American law enforcement had no jurisdiction in Mexico. The DEA could work with Mexican authorities, but cartel operations were embedded in regions where they had more power than the government. Labs were mobile. If one was discovered and shut down, another opened elsewhere within weeks. By 2010, it was clear that the methamphetamine crisis hadn't been solved. It had evolved. Meth-related deaths: 2008, 2,451 deaths; 2012, 4,028 deaths, 75%; 2015, 6,762 deaths, 176% from 2008; 2019, 1,667 deaths, 560% from 2008. 2023, approximately 32,000 deaths, 1,200% from 2008. That's 87 deaths per day in 2023, nearly 4 deaths per hour. For context, at its peak in 2005, before the precursor restrictions, meth killed approximately 4,500 Americans annually. By 2023, that number had increased more than 7-fold. The superlab era had made methamphetamine cheaper, purer, more available, and dramatically more lethal. Emergency department visits: 2010, near 94,000 meth-related ER visits nationally. 2015, 145,000 visits. 2020, 188,000 visits. 2023, estimated 125,000 visits. Geographic spread: methamphetamine was no longer primarily a rural Western problem. By 2020, every state in the US reported increasing meth-related deaths. Appalachia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio saw 300 to 500% increases in meth deaths 2010-2020. South, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana reported meth surpassing opioids as primary drug threat in some regions Midwest. Traditional meth territory saw continued devastation. South Dakota's per capita meth death rate, highest in nation by 2019 urban centers. Cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix reported meth as primary drug in homeless populations. The COVID-19 amplification. When the pandemic hit in 2020, methamphetamine deaths accelerated even further. Isolation increased use among dependent individuals. Treatment facilities closed or reduced capacity. Economic devastation drove new users. Supply chains remained intact, unlike some other drugs. Between 2019 and 2021, meth deaths increased approximately 34%, even while the nation's attention focused almost entirely on COVID-19. The polysubstance crisis. By 2020, a new pattern emerged that made the crisis even deadlier: methamphetamine plus fentanyl. Dealers began cutting meth with fentanyl or selling the combination. Users who'd built tolerance to meth had no tolerance to fentanyl. The result was a wave of unexpected overdose deaths. In 2023, approximately 42% of meth-related deaths also involved fentanyl. The drug that governments had created, pharmaceutical companies had profited from, and criminal organizations had industrialized, was now killing Americans at rates that exceeded its entire previous history. And the policy response remained focused on the same failed approach: arrest, prosecute, incarcerate. Despite 80 years of evidence showing that criminalization doesn't work, this story might have a happy ending. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian. The final chapters show you what we're still not addressing. Here's what didn't increase proportionally with the death toll. Federal funding for methamphetamine treatment: 2010, $90 million annually. 2023, $145 million annually, 61%. Meanwhile, meth deaths increased 1,200% in the same period. Available treatment beds in affected states. The states with the highest meth death rates consistently ranked among the lowest in treatment availability. Example: Oklahoma, 2022 data. Meth death rate: 15.4 per 100,000 dollars. National average: 11.2. Substance abuse treatment beds per capita: 38% below national average wait time for treatment, 3 to 6 weeks. Percentage of residents with insurance covering addiction treatment: 42%. The Medicaid gap. Many states with severe meth crises refused Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. This meant the poorest residents, those most likely to struggle with addiction, had no insurance coverage for treatment. States that refused expansion and had high meth rates: Oklahoma, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Tennessee, Mississippi. The pattern was consistent. The places suffering most from methamphetamine had the least infrastructure to address it. Treatment remained expensive, $5,000 to $30,000 for 30 to 90-day programs, largely privatized and inaccessible to most of those who needed it. Meanwhile, incarceration, which doesn't treat addiction, remained the default response. Cost to incarcerate someone for 1 year, $35,000 to $45,000. Cost of evidence-based addiction treatment, $8,000 to $15,000. The cheaper, more effective solution was consistently underfunded, while the expensive, ineffective solution consumed billions. While federal and state governments largely maintained punitive approaches, change began emerging from unexpected places: the communities most devastated by methamphetamine. Harm reduction activists began implementing strategies developed during the HIV/AIDS crisis. Needle exchange programs, providing clean syringes to prevent disease transmission among IV meth users. Naloxone distribution. Though designed for opioid overdoses, harm reduction centers distributed it to meth users who might encounter fentanyl-laced drugs. Safe consumption sites. Controversial facilities where users could consume drugs under medical supervision. Limited to a few cities, fierce political opposition. Former users became some of the most effective advocates. Crystal Odom, not related to the author, former meth user for 11 years, arrested 7 times, finally achieved recovery in 2014. She founded a peer support network in rural Arkansas that provided 24/7 crisis hotline, staffed by people in recovery transportation to treatment facilities, temporary housing for people in early recovery, job training and placement, legal advocacy for people with drug-related felony records. Her organization served 847 people in 2019. Recidivism rate among participants, 32%, compared to 60-70% for traditional approaches. When asked why it worked, Odom said, "Because we're not judging them. We're not telling them they're criminals or moral failures. We're saying the system failed you. The drug is designed to be addictive. It's not your fault you're dependent. And we can help you." Progressive prosecutors in some jurisdictions began implementing diversion programs. Larry Krasner, Philadelphia District Attorney, elected 2017, implemented policies. First-time possession charges diverted to treatment instead of prosecution. Reduced sentencing recommendations for non-violent drug offenses. Expungement programs for old drug convictions. Results in first 3 years. Drug incarceration decreased 64%. Treatment enrollment increased 38%. Recidivism among diverted defendants, 28% versus 45% for those prosecuted traditionally. Medical professionals pushed for medication-assisted treatment. Unlike opioid addiction, which has methadone and buprenorphine, methamphetamine addiction had no FDA-approved pharmaceutical treatment until very recently. But researchers identified existing medications that showed promise. Bupropion, antidepressant, reduced cravings. In some studies, naltrexone, opioid antagonist, showed modest benefit in combination with therapy. Mirtazapine, antidepressant, helped with sleep and anxiety during withdrawal. These weren't miracle cures, but they represented medical approaches instead of purely criminal justice responses. By 2020, some treatment centers were using combination therapy, medication plus intensive counseling plus peer support, Hans job training plus housing assistance. Success rates, 55% maintaining sobriety at 12 months, compared to 15 to 25% with incarceration alone. Between 2015 to 2023, some legislative and policy changes finally occurred. State-level reforms, Oregon, 2020, ballot measure. 110 decriminalized possession of small amounts of all drugs, including methamphetamine. Instead of arrest, users received a $100 citation and information about treatment. Results, 2021-2023. Drug arrests decreased 91%. Treatment center calls increased 40%. Overdose deaths continued rising, indicating decriminalization alone insufficient without treatment infrastructure. Washington State, 2021. Supreme Court ruled that simple drug possession law was unconstitutional. Legislature struggled to pass replacement, ultimately passing law, making first two possession offenses, misdemeanors with diversion to treatment. California, various years. Proposition 47, 2014, reclassified drug possession from felony to misdemeanor. Proposition 36, 2000, mandated treatment instead of incarceration for non-violent drug offenders. Impact: thousands released from prison, thousands more diverted from prison. But treatment system remained underfunded, leading to incomplete success. Federal changes. First Step Act, 2018, Federal Prison Reform. That reduced some mandatory minimums for drug offenses, allowed retroactive sentence reductions for crack cocaine offenses, expanded early release programs. Approximately 7,000 people released early, many serving drug sentences. But methamphetamine mandatory minimums largely unchanged. The law primarily benefited people convicted under old crack cocaine laws. The irony: the political will to reduce sentences for crack cocaine, historically associated with black users, emerged decades after the crisis. Methamphetamine, now affecting white rural Americans significantly, still faced harsh mandatory minimums. Economic transformation. Who profits now? As some states moved toward treatment-based approaches, a new profit sector emerged: private addiction treatment. Private equity firms began acquiring treatment centers. Luxury rehab facilities charging $30,000, $100,000 for 30 to 90 days. Insurance billing optimization became major focus. Marketing targeted families with resources. The pattern repeating again. Crisis created by corporations, pharmaceutical companies. Government response focused on punishment. Eventually, treatment approach gains support. New corporations profit from providing treatment. The people who suffered throughout, poor communities, people of color, those without resources, still had minimal access to quality treatment. Wealthy families could send children to luxury facilities in Malibu, with ocean views, gourmet food, yoga, and evidence-based treatment. Poor families waited 4 to 6 weeks for underfunded public programs, if they existed at all. By 2024, methamphetamine policy had evolved, but the evolution revealed new cruelties. Who profits versus who suffered. Pharmaceutical companies that distributed methamphetamine, 1945-1980, combined profits, tens of billions of dollars. Executives faced 0 criminal charges. Civil penalties paid, negligible compared to profits. Companies still exist, yes, most merged or rebranded, but corporate entities intact. People incarcerated for methamphetamine possession, 1970-2020. Total imprisoned, millions. Average time served, 2 to 8 years. Lives disrupted, careers ended, families separated, voting rights lost, permanent employment barriers, compensation received. 0 felony records expunged. Minimal, expensive, time-consuming process. Current situation, 2024. There are people still in prison serving sentences from the 1990s and 2000s for methamphetamine possession, the same drug that pharmaceutical companies legally sold to millions of Americans just decades earlier. Example case: Bobby Washington, black man, sentenced in 1995 in Alabama. Crime: possession of 15 grams of methamphetamine, intent to distribute. Sentence: 35 years, mandatory minimum, enhanced by prior non-violent drug conviction. Time served as of 2024, 29 years. Eligible for release 2030 at age 68. Bobby's sentence is longer than the entire career of executives who marketed Disoxin and suppressed addiction data. The expungement trap. Some states began offering expungement for old drug convictions. But the requirements were barriers themselves. Application fees, $500 to $2,000 in some states. Lawyer fees, $505,000 to navigate process waiting periods, 5 to 10 years after sentence completion. Eligibility restrictions. Often excluded if person had multiple convictions. The people most harmed by drug war, those with multiple convictions from addiction cycling through system, were least able to access relief. The ongoing disparity. Even as some reforms occurred, enforcement remained racially skewed. 2020 to 2023 data. Self-reported meth use rates roughly equal across racial groups. Arrest rates: black Americans arrested at 2.8x rate of white Americans. Conviction rates: black defendants 1.7x more likely to be convicted than white defendants for identical charges. Sentencing: black defendants received sentences averaging 26% longer than white defendants. The system had learned nothing. Even with some states decriminalizing, with some cities implementing diversion, the underlying machinery of racialized enforcement continued. The corporate sanitization. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies had successfully distanced themselves from the crisis. Modern marketing for ADHD medications, including amphetamine products, makes no mention of the meth crisis, of the overprescription era, of the millions harmed. Academic institutions accept donations from pharmaceutical companies with no acknowledgement of past harms. The history is being erased in real time, sanitized, reframed as different era, different circumstances. The erasure is happening now. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian to remember what they want forgotten. What would justice actually look like? It would mean acknowledging that this crisis was created, not discovered. Governments distributed methamphetamine to soldiers knowing risks. Pharmaceutical companies marketed it aggressively while suppressing safety data. Policymakers chose criminalization over treatment. Despite evidence, every phase was predictable and preventable. It would mean compensating those most harmed. Veterans given amphetamines in service, then criminalized for dependency. People imprisoned for possessing the drug. Pharmaceutical companies legally sold. Communities devastated by enforcement that targeted them disproportionately. Children who grew up in foster care because parents were incarcerated instead of treated. It would mean holding accountable those who made harmful decisions. Pharmaceutical executives who suppressed addiction, data. Policy makers who implemented racist enforcement officials who defunded treatment while expanding prisons. It would mean structural change to prevent repetition. Treating addiction as medical condition, not criminal behavior. Funding treatment at levels proportional to crisis scale. Ending racial disparities in enforcement. Expunging records automatically and without cost. Providing reparations to affected communities. None of this has happened. None of this appears likely to happen. The debt remains unpaid. The injustice continues. The pattern persists. Approximate number of Americans with criminal records for methamphetamine offenses, 4 and 6 million. Estimates vary. Number who've received compensation for wrongful prosecution. Effectively zero. Tiny number of individual cases, no systematic reparations. Number of pharmaceutical executives prosecuted for role in crisis. Zero current annual federal budget for methamphetamine treatment. 145 million current annual federal budget for drug law enforcement. $9.6 billion. The priorities remain unchanged. While methamphetamine continued devastating communities, another pharmaceutical-created crisis was unfolding simultaneously, and following the exact same script. The opioid timeline mirrors methamphetamine exactly. 1996, Purdue Pharma releases OxyContin, an opioid painkiller, marketed aggressively as non-addictive or minimally addictive. Internal documents later revealed company new addiction risk, pharmaceutical reps incentivized to push prescriptions, doctors prescribed freely. Trusting FDA approval, 1996-2010, prescription opioid epidemic. Millions of Americans become dependent, companies profit enormously. Addiction warnings emerge, are suppressed. Government response is slow, inadequate. 2010-2015, prescription restrictions implemented. Crackdown on pill mills, prescription monitoring databases. Doctors stop prescribing as freely, 2015-2024. Heroin and fentanyl epidemic. Dependent population still exists. Now without legal access. Black market fills gap with more dangerous alternatives. Fentanyl, 50-100x more potent than morphine. Floods market death toll explodes. 80,000 plus overdose deaths annually by 2022. The parallels are exact. Pharmaceutical company creates ARC markets, addictive drug mass dependency develops company profits, while suppressing warnings, restrictions implemented after, crisis, undeniable criminal market fills, gap with more dangerous product. Government criminalizes users instead of adequately funding treatment. Crisis escalates. Eventually, some reforms. New companies profit from treatment. Original corporate actors face minimal consequences. Purdue Pharma bankruptcy settlement, 2021. Sackler family, owners, agreed to pay $4.5 billion over 9 years. In exchange, immunity from all civil opioid claims. Estimated Sackler family wealth from OxyContin, 11 to 13 billion. They kept approximately $7 billion. No criminal charges against family members. The people who died, the families destroyed, the communities devastated, received fraction of harm caused. Compare that to millions incarcerated for opioid possession, mandatory minimum sentences 5 to 40 years for trafficking, no immunity deals for street-level dealers, no retention of profits for low-level distributors. And now, fentanyl is being found in methamphetamine. The two crises have merged into a polysubstance nightmare. 2023 data. 42% of meth-related deaths involve fentanyl. 28% of fentanyl deaths involve meth users. Often don't know their meth contains. Fentanyl test strips exist, but aren't widely distributed. Naloxone, opioid overdose reversal, doesn't work on meth overdose. First responders often can't determine which drug caused overdose. The system that failed to learn from methamphetamine failed to learn from opioids and is currently failing to adequately respond to fentanyl. The insanity of repeating patterns. Prescription stimulants for ADHD, Adderall, Vivancy, currently being prescribed at record rates. Some doctors warning about potential for abuse and dependency. Warnings being dismissed as overreaction. Pharmaceutical companies marketing aggressively. Anyone seeing the pattern. We are potentially in the early stages of another cycle. The warning signs are identical. The response is identical. The outcome will be predictable. From ancient plant to modern devastation, methamphetamine's history reveals patterns of systematic harm driven by profit and power. But crucial questions remain not just unanswered, they remain largely unasked. 1. What did early military officials know about long-term methamphetamine effects before authorizing mass distribution? Sealed WWII-era medical research documents remain classified. What do they contain? What did the Wehrmacht, Imperial Japanese military, and US armed forces know about permanent damage, addiction potential, and psychological effects? When exactly did they know it? Who made decisions to proceed despite that knowledge? 2. Why are pharmaceutical company internal documents about methamphetamine safety still protected? Smith, Klein, and French, Abbott Laboratories, Burroughs, Wellcome. Their internal research and communications about addiction risks from the 1940s, 1970s exist. Most remain sealed under corporate protections. What would full disclosure reveal? Which executives wrote what memos? What studies were suppressed? 3. How much current pharmaceutical industry wealth traces directly to methamphetamine-era profits? The companies that profited from methamphetamine either still exist or merged into current pharmaceutical giants. That capital was invested, reinvested, compounded. How much of GSK's, formerly Smith, Klein, and French, current $43 billion market cap traces to Desoxin profits? Where did that money go? Who inherited it? 4. Why has no government official ever been held accountable for policies that demonstrably caused mass harm? The officials who authorized continued methamphetamine distribution despite evidence. The DEA administrators who implemented racially disparate enforcement. The legislators who passed mandatory minimums they knew would devastate communities. All operated with legal immunity. Why? When does policy failure become criminal negligence? 5. What would true reparations look like? For the soldiers given pills that destroyed them. For the civilians prescribed medications that created dependency. For the communities targeted by discriminatory enforcement. For the children who grew up without parents incarcerated for possessing what pharmaceutical companies legally sold. Is there a number? Is there a process? Will it ever happen? 6. Who currently profits from the methamphetamine treatment industry? Private equity has acquired numerous addiction treatment centers. Some charge $50,000 to $100,000 for 90-day programs. Insurance billing is optimized for maximum profit. Are we repeating the pattern? Those who can't access expensive treatment get incarcerated. Those with resources get luxury rehab. 7. Why do we continue criminalizing drug users when 80+ years of evidence shows it doesn't work? Every study, every policy experiment, every international comparison shows treatment is more effective and cheaper than incarceration. Yet, we maintain criminal justice approach. Why? Who benefits from continued criminalization? Private prisons, prison labor, political messaging. 8. What's happening right now that we'll look back on with horror in 20 years? Prescription stimulants at record highs. New synthetic drugs being developed. Treatment infrastructure still underfunded. Enforcement still racially disparate. What current policy will be the next scandal? 9. How many people are in prison right now for possessing what pharmaceutical companies legally sold? Exact number unknown. Best estimates, hundreds of thousands. Many serving decades for possession quantities equivalent to single prescriptions from the 1960s. Where is the justice? 10. Will the documents ever be fully disclosed? The classified military research, the sealed pharmaceutical records, the internal government memos, they exist. Historians know they exist. Will they be released before everyone involved is dead? Or will this history be sanitized, the uncomfortable truths buried with the decision makers? 11. What is the dollar value of 80 years of destruction? Medical costs, lost productivity, incarceration costs, child welfare costs, environmental cleanup, lost lives, destroyed families, devastated communities. If you calculated the actual cost of every decision from 1938 to 2024, what's the number? Trillions, and who paid it? Not pharmaceutical companies, not government officials. The victims paid it. 12. Is this still happening in other countries? The crystal meth epidemic is now global. Philippines, Thailand, Australia, particularly affected. Are other governments repeating the same failures, making the same choices, creating the same injustices? From the humid mountains where Ephedra sinica grew 5,000 years ago, to the emergency rooms of 2024, where patients die from methamphetamine fentanyl combinations, the trajectory is clear. What began as medicine was transformed into weapon. Governments weaponized it for war. Corporations weaponized it for profit. Policymakers weaponized it for control. At every phase, those with power knew more than they admitted. The Wehrmacht doctors documented psychosis and cardiac deaths, and distribution continued. Japanese officials received reports of catastrophic harm, and productivity targets took priority. American pharmaceutical executives suppressed addiction warnings and marketed more aggressively. The pattern isn't accidental, it's structural. Systems built to maximize profit and power will always sacrifice the vulnerable to achieve those goals. The drug itself is almost irrelevant. The pattern would repeat with any substance offering similar utility. And it is repeating right now. With prescription stimulants, with synthetic opioids, with whatever comes next. The fundamental question isn't about methamphetamine. The fundamental question is, what kind of society allows this? A society that values corporate profit over human life. A society that criminalizes suffering while protecting power. A society that treats addiction as moral failure instead of medical condition. A society that learns nothing from history because those who made the decisions never face consequences. Was methamphetamine's devastation unintended science or predictable cost? The laboratory notes exist. They document warnings. They record decisions to proceed despite warnings. They show pattern of profit prioritized over safety, expansion over ethics, success defined as quarterly earnings, not human well-being. This wasn't accident. This was choice. Repeated choice. At every inflection point, those with power chose harm. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when emergency sirens echo through streets that never asked for this experiment, when parents watch children destroyed by addiction, when communities struggle to function after decades of devastation, the chemical echo of a century of choices still moves through blood that never consented. The plant still grows in those ancient mountains, unaware, unchanged by what humans made of it. The superlabs still operate in Sinaloa and Jalisco, producing thousands of pounds for insatiable American demand. The treatment centers are still underfunded, turning away desperate people daily. The prisons are still full of people serving decades for possessing what was once prescribed by doctors. The pharmaceutical executives still live comfortably, their wealth protected, their legacies sanitized. The files that could answer every remaining question still sit in archives, classified, sealed, protected. Someone decided you don't get to see them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And the greatest unanswered question remains: when will we learn? This is why 12 AM Historian exists, to assemble the truths they don't want connected. Subscribe now. Share this everywhere. The conversation that needs to happen starts in the comments. What shocked you most? What patterns do you see repeating today? Where do we go from here? The next chapter of this story is being written right now, and this time you get to see it happening. Don't look away.